You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare, hosted by Mick Cook.
Now, I know there are a lot of staff officers that listen to this show. In fact, I was a staff officer when I started creating this show. Not so much anymore. I'm a bit old and decrepit. But you know who wasn't old and decrepit? The staff officers operating in the headquarters at Gallipoli in the First World War. Imagine being a staff officer, just like you are now, but you're on the Gallipoli Peninsula. G'day, listeners, and welcome back to The Dead Prussian. This is the second episode for the 2025 season, and at the moment it may be the only or the last episode of the 2025 season. So a very short season this year, but it is good to see the reaction of the listeners after we released the last episode 119, on orchestrating power. That was a very fun episode, and more fun was checking the stats of all the listeners that downloaded it. And as I've always said, download it and play the ads. I don't care if you listen to the actual episode, as long as you tick over the counter that sends the dollars my way. At this rate, in a couple of 100 years, I will be 100-air. Now, we're coming up to 10 years of the show, so that's pretty impressive as well. So for this season, I did want to make sure that I was doing content that I was interested in, but also talking to people I actually want to talk to, as opposed to most of my guests, I know you're listening, who I really couldn't give a bob about. But I'm very lucky tonight. It's tonight that I'm recording it in Australia at night time here, and my guest is actually living in the future an hour ahead of me, and he's an expert in the First World War. My guest is, of course, Dr. Rhys Crawley. He is a senior lecturer at UNSW Canberra and the Australian Defence Force Academy, a great institution, produces the best graduates I've heard. He is a historian by profession and one of the official historians for Australia's experience in the war in Afghanistan. Now, Rhys and some folks recently released a book called Inside GHQ, The Gallipoli Diary of Captain Orlo Williams. Now, I haven't read it. Like my listeners know, I've quite often found it easier just to call up the author of a book and find out what the book's about. I'm sure that really impresses them and their publisher. But it is on my list of summer reading. I tend to do most of my military history reading over summer because I save most of my year for good books as opposed to military history books. But this is a new book. It's out, and it provides a bit of a different perspective, I've heard, because I haven't read it, on Gallipoli. I know a lot of my Australian listeners, a lot of my British listeners too, and probably Canadian listeners should be very interested in the Gallipoli Campaign. And if you don't know what the Gallipoli Campaign was, go back and listen to some of my other interviews with Rhys, because he's written another book on his first book, Climax at Gallipoli. Terrible name, but a book that covers off the Australian experience in the withdrawal from the Gallipoli campaign. Actually, I've got a copy of that book. I'm not sure if I've read that yet. No one tell Rhys. So, Rhys, welcome to the show.
G'day, Mick. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be able to make it in for possibly the second episode of 2025, and to follow Nate as well. So a common friend, which is wonderful.
Yeah, this really is turning into a couple of mates in a shed type podcast at the moment, and we all know how popular they are. Look, Rhys, you've been on the show before, and our guests have probably heard it before, but our listeners, you're the guest, they're the listeners. Our listeners have probably heard it before, but I don't really care if they have to hear it again, because maybe your perspective has changed. Maybe I should change become to remain in this question, but what made you decide to become/remain a military historian?
I honestly can't remember what I said last time, and I didn't go back and listen to the episode because I didn't want to give you any more revenue from ad listens, mate. But I have just been fascinated by history in all its senses since I was a little kid. I loved local history when I was in primary school. And I was just always fascinated by figuring out things that had happened in the past and trying to put myself in someone else's shoes. So that whole issue of empathy before you know what it's called, I got it as a kid. And I just pursued that passion. I wasn't very good at other things at school, and I wasn't the top history student, but I was just passionate about it. And somehow that turned into a career. I just kept going to uni and kept getting more accolades and had a bit of luck along the way to get a job. And how I've remained it is people have just kept giving me jobs to do my hobby, which is amazing. And I still pinch myself every day that I get to go to work. I get to educate military cadets at the Australian Defence Force Academy. I get to write books that I think are important. I get to talk about history and hopefully share some of that passion with, well, anyone who wants it and who wants a sort of a bit of nuance in their history. So that's sort of how it all happened. In terms of military history, it was no different than any other kind of history. I had some really good teachers that happened to be interested in that as well, and so I thought I'll just pursue topics that allowed me to keep working with really cool lecturers when I was an honours student. And then you kind of got to specialise in something eventually, which is what I did for the PhD, and I specialised in the Gallipoli Campaign. And 15 years later, I'm still writing about it. Every now and then it draws me back. I've just, we're here talking about Inside GHQ. That's my third Gallipoli book. I can't escape it. It just keeps drawing me back in. It's fascinating. I love learning new things about it and sharing that with anyone, your listeners, you, the readers. It's just fun.
It sounds like an excellent hobby. Being a military historian is definitely a better hobby than being someone who interviews military historians as a hobby, because people are paying you for your hobby, whereas I have to beg for people to listen to Spotify ads. So it's definitely the wiser choice out of the two that are on the call tonight.
And Mick, I'll interrupt you. Your listeners might not know that I used to get paid to interview people as well.
Yeah, that's true.
And I might have interviewed someone who's on the other end of this microphone at some point.
I do like to remind Rhys that I was his number one interview from the Official History Project. It has nothing to do with the quality of the interview and definitely nothing to do with any of my service. It's just because I was pretty early on the project, so I was number one. In terms of formal interviews for that particular part of the history project. So, yeah, it's really good. Yeah, you did used to get, good. So you're definitely better than me, because people also paid you to interview people. I'm so glad you raised that. So let's talk about Captain Orlo Williams before I start crying into my cup of tea that mysteriously looks a lot like a whiskey glass. This book, right? It's the diary of Captain Orlo Williams, and as people can guess probably from my intro, he was a staff officer. But can you tell us a bit more about who Captain Orlo Williams was?
Yeah, he's a fascinating character. Maybe I'll tell you how I came about this character to start with. So when I was a PhD student, I was doing research at the Imperial War Museum in London, and I was reading this diary that was often quoted in books about Gallipoli, but it'd usually be a line or two, and it was this guy, Orlo Williams. And so I went and did, what others had done before me and looked at this diary. At that time, you couldn't take digital photographs of archives, certainly at the Imperial War Museum, it wasn't permitted. And so most people would sort of persevere with his handwriting, which was just terrible, really small and just really difficult to read. And so they might spend half an hour just looking for some choice quotes, and that's what would make it into the book. But I had a bit more time up my sleeve, and I read quite a lot of it, and I was just blown away by this diary. It was the best diary I'd ever read. Right? And so he's a British staff officer, a civilian in his pre-war life, and a civilian in his post-war life. So he wasn't a military man. He worked in the House of Commons as a clerk. Really well-educated young guy. He'd gone to Eton. He'd gone to Oxford. His family, all the men in his family were senior men in the law. King's or Queen's counsels. Some on privy councillors. This is a really upper-class, well-educated young guy. And on war's outbreak, he shifted from his work in the House of Commons to the War Office, and he was working in this section in the War Office, again as a civilian, and they were essentially responsible for all the sensitive, secretive stuff. So, and that included enciphering and deciphering secret cables between the War Office and its theatres around the world, whether that was in France or in Belgium or wherever it was. And so he was doing that in a civilian capacity, and then he eventually enlisted, and he enlisted, and he gets put into what was headquarters for Gallipoli, and he goes off with the original contingent. But so I came across this guy. I mean, I wasn't the first to come by his writings, but I was the first really to, or at least I thought I was the first, to be able to spend a bit more time with this guy's diaries and really tease them out. And what I did when I was still doing my PhD, I came back to Australia, and I wrote to the Imperial War Museum and asked that they pass it on to whoever the copyright holders were of the diary, and requested permission to publish the diary. I'd never published anything, and they said yes. And so that it's a bit embarrassing how long ago that was, given that the book has just recently come out. But I got permission to publish this book from the family, and it's the granddaughter of Orlo Williams, in 2009.
Yeah.
So I read the diary in 2008, got permission in 2009, and the first task was to start typing up, basically transcribing this handwriting into a Word document. And the diary ended up being 80,000 words, and so it was a lot of work.
Yeah.
And then career-wise, just took me sort of away from it. Right, I'd work on other projects that paid the bills, and Orlo was always kind of in the background as this unfinished but not top priority project. But I was always fascinated, always felt guilty that it wasn't finished. And I really wanted to share his diary with more people and make it an accessible primary source, really, because his insights, and I'm sure we'll get to these, his insights into what happened at Gallipoli are unlike any other insights we have. He was a staff officer, he's a civilian, so he's not pretending to be a military genius. He's not pretending to know the intricacies of tactics or operational planning or strategy, but he's this sort of fly-on-the-wall observer. He must have been a fantastic guy, because everyone seemed to have been friends with him and confide in him. And he was writing it all in his diary every day. And so there's a lot of gossip in his diary, but he was also the cipher officer. And so he'd been doing that cipher job at the War Office in London. He deploys to Gallipoli, goes out with the general and his staff, and his job is to encipher and decipher the sensitive cables that have got to transmit from, Gallipoli to London. The recipient will be the Prime Minister or the Secretary of State or the King. And so often he's the first person to encode it or then decode it. And so he knows about stuff in advance of even the generals or the King. And he's writing it all down in his diary like a really naughty boy, breaking all the OPSEC rules.
Yeah.
And it's just all there. And he's just, that fly on the wall, fantastic character, really clever, funny. He's witty, and he's just so smart. So he's a great character to get to know. And the thing I love about the book, other than the fact it's finally finished, thanks largely to Steve and Ashley, so Steve Chambers and Ashley Brown, who came on board and would never have got finished without them. But the best thing is we can share this amazing primary source that covers every day of the Gallipoli campaign from a headquarters perspective, which is not an arse-covering activity, which some of the biographies that came out immediately after the war were.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting for international guests, I'm sure. Our listeners, keep calling the listeners guests. Maybe I should just do one big group chat. Arse covering is a term that some of the Anglophile countries use to mean to look after one's own interest. It's good to have a guest that speaks like me, which means I now have to speak like a guest. But I imagine, Rhys, that it was like just listening to you, your passion for having this guy's story. This guy, he the listeners will find out when they read your book that he went on. I don't know if you actually cover what he went on to later on in life, but he wasn't just retired Captain Orlo Williams. He was he went on, got some achievements of his own. Dr Orlo Williams, CBMC sort of fellow. So
Yeah, he could have had any career, I think. He's one of those, fortunate, came from money, phenomenally well educated. And the war was just kind of a blip and a really important, clearly a really important part of this guy's life. But he never considered himself a military man, although he wore his medals with pride. But he had 40 years in the civil service, and he became the principal clerk for the House of Commons. Like this guy mattered, right? And he knew all the politicians. He could have been a politician. His friends were, he was good friends with Winston Churchill's brother, who was at Gallipoli serving in the same staff.
Yep.
He writes about Winston as Winston. It's and there's all these people that appear in his diary. It's just this fascinating kind of this civilian soldier temporarily, overachiever, and thankfully he was a writer as well. So his diary is amazing. But the guy wrote 17 books. In his life. He'd written some before he went to Gallipoli.
If you Google him, he comes up as an author. That's like his main sort of byline if you Google, like Orlo Williams, author.
Yeah, and he was also like an amazing piano player, and he's a literary critic, and he'd write poetry and novels, and he was fluent in 5 languages. So some of his books are translations from French and Italian.
Sounds like the kind of guy that makes T.E. Lawrence jealous, right? Like.
Yeah, and they would have known each other too.
Yeah, that's right. They're probably mates. They probably went to the same drinking group. Now, Rhys, we probably should move on to the next question, just so that your wife doesn't hear you talking about Orlo Williams and start to get jealous of your affection. But the book is inside GHQ, so from what I understand, this is very much an insider's view of the General Headquarters at Gallipoli. I've probably just answered my next question by that last sentence I just said. But I guess for our listeners who don't know much about the Gallipoli campaign, I guess for a lot of Australians too, who aren't used to hearing an Australian historian talk about a Brit at Gallipoli without spitting on the floor. Well, I suppose that's more of our popular historians as opposed to our legitimate military historians. But I guess, can you explain for our listeners, what was GHQ?
Yeah, so it's essentially an army-level headquarters, right? It's got multiple corps that sit under it, and it's there. It exists to support the general, to transmit his will to the subordinate formations. This will be, for any of your military staff officers that are listening, this is a staff at the initiation of the Gallipoli campaign that's only a few dozen people, and that includes the batman. Right. This is a tiny staff for an army. Yeah. We'd have more than that now at a task group level, right? So, and it was sort of in the First World War, kind of the third 11 went to Gallipoli, right? The best staff officers went to the Western Front.
Yep.
And they commanded, or they went into staff roles, or they were killed or wounded or whatever. And so the sort of second or third 11, we'd say in cricket terms, but they're not the first, they're not the best, and some of them become the best by the end of the war. But I send them out to Gallipoli, and GHQ there was essentially it was never on the Gallipoli Peninsula itself. At different times, it was on board ship because it needed to be able to move between sort of sectors at Gallipoli, which were quite distant from each other, or it was on islands off the Gallipoli Peninsula, so transmitting via wireless or whatever. He sat in the general staff. So there was the general staff that did the sort of operational and intelligence work and issued plans and collected intelligence. And then there was the administrative staff that did logistics and discipline and that sort of stuff. He sat in the general staff, and so he's privy to the staff discussions, where they're sitting around a table workshopping an O plan, or what we'd call today an O plan, or then drafting orders and issuing them out to subordinates. So he sat in that area as a pretty junior, so as a general staff officer, grade 3, captain, kind of the lowest staff gig you could have in that headquarters, and really kind of getting. The ciphering work was important because you had to be accurate, you had to be able to do it quickly. It's obviously sensitive, But he also, when he wasn't doing that, he would keep the war diary for GHQ. So that's recording all important decisions. That's attaching all the important documentation. So anyone who studies Gallipoli and wants to understand sort of how a decision is made and why it's made and the results of that, they probably wouldn't know. But if they're looking at a headquarters level, it's going to be all those writing. And for the war diary, it's actually much neater handwriting than his own personal diary. But yeah, I mean, headquarters was kind of it was an operational level headquarters. It communicated multiple times a day with London, whether that was the War Office or generals back in London or politicians, and so that would all go through Orlo. Anything destined for London, or if it needed to go to Egypt or any other theatre, he would send that on behalf of the general who commanded at Gallipoli. So he had this, and headquarters just essentially was an observer. When the fight was on, it was almost a passive observer, and then it would get involved if something went wrong and the general needed to insert himself to alter the direction of an operation or something like that, and then the staff would perform a role there. If you're going to characterize GHQ at Gallipoli, dysfunctional is absolutely the appropriate term. Partly it's through structures, partly it's through a physical separation between your planners and your logisticians and your medical folk. Partly it's through overwork. Mostly I think it's through personalities. And so you get
a standard headquarters then.
Yeah, absolutely. And anyone who reads this who's worked in a headquarters is going to see that, right? The personalities are key. People clash. People get annoyed that one's getting promoted and the other's not. They gossip about each other. There's infighting. There's jealousy. There's all of that at play, all those human factors within this cauldron of stress, right? While there's just casualties after casualties and a campaign that at no point succeeds until it ends and they evacuate with success, right? So it's stressful. They're learning, they're failing, and it's still so much hinges on that kind of the personality of the commander and the ability of the commander to kind of impose his will. Whereas I think, there's a lot of writing now about a general at a divisional level is more of a manager than they are, that traditional general, this is my view, I'll order you to do it. At Gallipoli, it was still that, this is my view, I'll order you to do it. And so you see that playing out. You get from Orlo, you get his views on the general, and often you'll get his views on others in the staff. But what's even better is when you get the views of others in the staff about the general. Professional military men who will be questioning General Ian Hamilton's military decision making.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like the parallels with modern headquarters. It means we've learned a lot in the past 110 years in terms of what makes a good headquarters good, right? And what makes a bad headquarters. But hey, for GHQ, the results speak for themselves, right? So what a campaign. I guess there's a fair bit to unpack already, and I'm not going to do it because I'm lazy, but we're going to go to question 4 because I think you'll be able to do a lot more of the unpacking that you've already done anyway. So I'll just defer a lot of those to the professional military historian or the professional hobbyist, as we determined tonight. Now, this question relates about the diary's impact. Now, when I ask this next question, I guess what I'm getting at is not only importance in terms of the time or importance for historians, but I guess for people reading it now and also future and access to things like primary sources, right? Because not everyone interested in history has access to primary sources. It's a pretty lucky opportunity to do things like go study and do archival research at places like the Imperial War Museum. So I guess in terms of publishing this, why is the Williams Diary a significantly important piece of history for the Gallipoli Campaign, but also for how we view the Gallipoli Campaign?
Yeah, I mean, its content speaks for itself, and the fact that I still think it's the best diary I've ever read, from any war, right? It's just so the content is so rich, it's so personal, and it's so intelligent, so well written. Our editorial pen was really, really light. Our main focus was making sure we were accurate to what he had written rather than trying to change it. So that content being able to have a wider audience than a person who can go and travel to London and sit there and read as much of the diary as they can in a couple of days if they've got that, just making that available. I mean, that's why we did it, right? It's primary sources matter. Not everything he wrote was accurate, and that's fine, right? He got stuff wrong. His perspective was pretty funny on some things, but you can see the kind of the confusion of the fog of war, right? So you love Big Carl. You can see the fog of war coming through in those pages where they've got limited information to make decisions. You can see this stress between the civil military levels. You can see where that's not working. So having all of that available in a book that you can get it in all its formats for really cheap. It's the only book I've ever published that's not expensive, right? And it's also probably the only one I've ever published that's a good read. But on top of that, we also were able to publish his photographs. So I don't know how many there are in the book, maybe 60 or something, photographs that he took. So he would, it's at headquarters. So we get these photos of all these characters that generally we didn't even know what they look like. He mentions over 300 people in his diary. So we were able to provide biographies, quite short biographies, but provide full names and biographies for those more than 300 people.
Wow.
And then these photos where he's talking, he's writing about what he can see from the ship while the landings are occurring at Gallipoli, and he's describing where he is in the ship and where the guns are, and they're thundering. He's on the Queen Elizabeth. It's got its 15-inch guns, and he's talking about the effect that's having on him. And then he does a sketch, and the sketch is, this kind of wonderful survey. It would have taken him 2 seconds to do, of what he can see on the peninsula. And then he's got a photograph, and so you can put those three things together, and it just it brings it to life. And until this book, you had to go and get the box at the Imperial War Museum. So, I'm all about primary sources. I think any historian that cares about the nuance and cares about the discipline and cares about the craft of producing books wants access to primary sources. This isn't a digitized one until we produce the book. And, it took so long to even decipher his own handwriting that people could never appreciate the true value of his diary. So having it out there, making it accessible to other people was why I kept going with it for way too long. And actually why I'm so glad that Stephen and Ashley joined me. So Ashley, PhD student at UNSW Canberra, has worked with me on the official history of Afghanistan for a really long time, phenomenal colleague. She came in and she just pushed it over the line. And Stephen is a Gallipoli expert. And so he was able to bring in, we write these introductions to each chapter. So we basically split the diary into months. And then each chapter has an intro essay, which discusses, gives the reader, sets the scene for people who've maybe never read anything about Gallipoli or need a refresher. And it's done in a really short way because the focus is on his diary.
Yeah.
Replete with its errors. And it's just, it's phenomenal. I don't know if that answered your question, but making this available is exciting.
Well, it did definitely answer my question, particularly about access to primary sources. Particularly, one of my bugbears is the amount of popular historians out there who don't get it right because they don't necessarily go to the primary sources, or the way they misrepresent primary sources to, reinforce a colloquial narrative quite a lot. For those people that don't know much about Australian popular historians, we won every war we've fought just by the sheer pluck and larrikinism of the Australian digger. Now, don't actually check and see how many wars were won that were fought in. We won the ones that counted, I guess. And that's excluding the one I fought in. But I think another important distinction that you made there in that was that you read a lot of war diaries. And you're not out there breaking into people's homes and just sitting down on the corner of their bed and reading their diaries, because that would be awkward. So it's an important distinction for our listeners to understand. Military historians, they read war diaries. They don't just read everyone else's diary. I don't actually know if I ever sent the official history, my diary, but if I did, that would rate probably as the worst diary that a military historian's ever read, because on some dates I just wrote not much happening or a really fun day, and a really fun day was a euphemism. So I'm glad that there's people out there that put a lot of effort into them, because some of us are really lazy, and I typed mine on a computer, like there was no reason to be lazy. So it's you did answer the question, particularly the thing that really drives this podcast is trying to get people talking about war and its relationship with society, because it's a toxic relationship. We need to have a divorce, and ways that people can learn about war, I think, is important, and learning about it firsthand from primary sources, or having people like yourself out there using these primary sources, either publishing them like you have here, a passion project, and you kick yourself for saying it's too long, but hey, it's only too long if it never happens, right? I'm sure the families are very, very grateful that it's out there. But we do have to get to the final question on the show, the defining question of the show, the butcher's bill, to use a term that was quite often used in the First World War, or for guests when they come on the show. And it's about Big Carl's mission in defining war, and every guest gets to finish the sentence "war is." Now, you've done this before, and like a poor podcast host, I didn't look up your previous answer, because I don't care about past Rhys. I care about current Rhys. And as soon as I hang up tonight, I'm only caring about future Rhys. So my question to you, Rhys, is, can you please finish the sentence, "War is"?
War is complicated, and I hope that's not the answer I gave last time. But my job is to read as much as I can and try and understand it. And I find the more I try and understand it, the less I succeed in that. And for me, this diary is just another example of how complicated that is. I think, but a thing that has come out in this book and in my Afghanistan work is actually the centrality of people, and that shouldn't be a shock to anyone. And people, I'm sure, have, war is a human endeavor or whatever. People have given that answer, but people can make or break how a headquarters functions. They can make or break the right or the wrong decisions, and it's complicated. For this guy in his really small world, he shows that complexity and that complication on a daily basis, and that helps plug the book as well. But it's a horrible question you ask, because. And particularly of a historian, where the answer is always, it's complicated anyway. But I really think that we ought to keep studying it, because it's a horrible thing. And the nuance of it matters. The nuance of how a strategy was made matters. The nuance of the problems of translating that strategy, that really poor strategy, into some operational plan that obviously didn't work, was complicated. The poor tacticians and soldiers that fought and died to try and turn an unworkable operational plan that came out of a terrible strategy into something successful and ultimately fail. It's complicated. So I think it's a probably entirely terrible answer, but and I really hope it's not the one I used last time. But as I said, I didn't go and check because like you, I was a bit lazy.
No, I'm pretty sure it's not the one you used last time. Just because I don't think you were that insightful last time.
Here I was thinking I was babbling.
What no, you babbled at the end. But what listeners don't know is, like, when we talk about those interviews, like, the first time I interviewed you for this show, we literally then turned the microphones around, and then you interviewed me for the official history project. So it was, put the shoe on the other foot. So I literally can't remember, because it was a pretty big day, to be honest. A pretty big day. But a good host would go back and check that. I'm an award-winning host. I'm not a good host. There's a difference. And like anyone who has someone else beat them out for an award, there's ways people win awards, right? And it's not necessarily about being the best. But it's very important definition for this show, because, one of the key points, as you explained, the complication element of war is, it's horrible, right? It is bad, but it is complicated. It continues. I don't know how it will stop. The human element of war, I think, is very, very important, especially in a day and age when technology is being touted as a solution to winning wars. No one's ever won a war through technology alone. Someone still has to decide to end the war. It's about the human element. So, Rhys, I really, really appreciate you coming on the show, talking to us about Orlo Williams, who sounds like an absolute, I think a lot of the internet would say, an absolute Chad, superstar. I don't know if Chad's an insult in America because they have it as a name, but an absolute Chad is the young ones tell me that's pretty cool. Young ones being people in their 30s.
I'm lost. I've got no idea what you're talking about.
So it is great to have you back on the show, and it's a great way to close out 10 years of the podcast.
Again, thanks for having me. Congrats on 10 years. Commiserations to your listeners for having to listen to you for 10 years. But I think it's phenomenal. Personally, it's great that you've done it. It's fantastic. You've given lots of historians a chance to talk about their passion projects and the things that they think matter. So on a personal note, well done. I hope you keep going. And then have me on when I finish another book, hopefully not a Gallipoli one.
I'll get you on for the official history, and you can just talk just about me. Which ladies and gentlemen, as the official history gets written, I will be a footnote on an on the roll or something somewhere. It will be a book well worth, and I'm definitely I'm locking you in for talking about that as soon as it comes out, maybe with one of your co-authors as well. Ladies and gentlemen, you can get like when Rhys said it's a reasonably priced book, I didn't believe him, because all of his other books I've had to take out mortgages to get. Actually, that's not true. I think I got one for free. But academic books, proper academic books, sometimes can be quite costly, but not this one. So it's published by Little Gully Publishing, and you can get it on Amazon. If you're a Kindle reader, you can get it for $12. Not even $12. That's me rounding up. And $12 Australian is like $1 in euro terms, and maybe $1.50 for the US. Maybe $1.25 for pounds, or £1.25 pence. Not quite that difference on the conversion rate, but it's not that great for Australia right now. But it's quite cheap, and with what you're getting, it's very rare that you can find a primary source that does not cost you an arm and a leg. And if anyone is a Roman history fan and has any of Ronald Syme's books from the 1930s and 1940s, and these are secondary history books, I've got a book that costs $500 because they don't make them like that anymore, right? And this is a chance where they actually do make them like that now. So go out there and get it. The links will be in the show notes. I'll link you to both Little Gully and also to Amazon. Feel free to buy from the smaller operator, although you'll find Little Gully points you to Amazon anyway. So Bezos is going to get the coin no matter what. And I'm sure there's lots of other people that benefit from our efforts in a way that we don't in terms of money, but that's okay. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Follow the Dead Prussian podcast on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod and Facebook at facebook.com/thedeadprussian. The Dead Prussian podcast is hosted and produced by Mick Cook. The Dead Prussian podcast is copyright of Mick Cook.